The gates of Buckingham Palace shimmered in the midday sun. Tourists gathered with cameras out, smiling and posing as the Queen's Guard stood motionless in perfect form. But not everyone was smiling. Just beyond the ropes, a young woman stood with her head lowered, her shoulders trembling. She wiped at her face quickly, as if embarrassed by the tears. Most people didn't notice. One or two glanced, then looked away. But the guard saw her. Without a blink, without turning his head, he stepped just slightly forward and, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, said, "Are you all right, miss?" A gasp rippled through the crowd. One phone came up, then two. A murmur spread across the square. A royal guard had just spoken. What no one around her knew was that the guard hadn't broken silence out of sympathy. He saw something in her, the way she stood, the way she cried, that took him back to someone he once swore to protect, and never got the chance. Before we reveal the story behind that moment, hit subscribe and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes silence says everything. Corporal James Hart had worn the uniform for 11 years. Infantry first, then ceremonial duty. Last year, he was posted to the Queen's Guard, a position reserved for those who didn't just follow orders, but embodied them. Among his unit, he was known for his silence, precise, unshakable. The kind of man who didn't blink in front of protesters, didn't flinch in the cold, and once stood his full shift with a sprained ankle, without ever leaning on the rifle. But beneath that composure, there was more. 2 years earlier, he had lost his younger sister Lily to cancer. They had grown up visiting Buckingham Palace together. Mock salutes, tourist photos, laughter on the lawn. She used to say, "You'll guard that gate someday, Jamie. I just know it." When she passed, he stopped visiting the palace, until he was posted to it. Tucked beneath his uniform, hidden behind polished brass and ceremony, was a small charm looped through his dog tag. Just 3 engraved letters, LH, her initials. A piece of her he carried every day. He never spoke of her. Never had to. He once told a fellow guard quietly, "This uniform isn't just rules. It's memory. It's everything I carry that I can't say out loud." It was just past noon at Buckingham Palace. The crowd outside the gates was its usual mix, tourists posing with outstretched arms, couples taking selfies, children mimicking the guard's posture, while parents laughed softly behind their phones. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the gravel. And among the laughter, the movement, the posing, one girl stood completely still. She couldn't have been more than 20. Slim frame, dark jacket, hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't making a sound. Just standing there, quietly crying, shoulders shaking, as if trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. Most people didn't notice her. A few glanced and looked away. One man lifted his phone, filming her for reasons only he understood. But the guard noticed. Corporal James Hart saw her from the corner of his eye. Her posture, her silence, her age. The way she seemed to be holding her breath, like his sister had the day the doctor said the word terminal. Something about the way this girl stood triggered a memory so sharp, it cut straight through the barrier he had trained to never lower. She stepped closer to the rope, still within public bounds, but just near enough. Her lips trembled. A tear slipped past her cheek and dropped to the gravel. Hart took one breath, deep, measured, and he spoke. "Are you all right, miss?" The words were soft, steady, and just loud enough to carry. Gasps broke the air around him. Phones turned. One woman whispered, "Did he just talk?" The crowd fell silent. Not because they were told to, but because something sacred had just shifted. For a second, the square stood still. The crowd around Buckingham Palace, once buzzing with laughter and camera shutters, went silent. People looked at each other, then back at the guard. A few blinked, unsure if they'd actually heard what they thought they had. And then it sank in. The royal guard had spoken. A man who wasn't supposed to move, let alone talk, had broken his silence for a girl with tears in her eyes. A couple in the front row instinctively began to clap, slowly at first, as if they were unsure whether it was allowed. A child near the edge of the rope turned to his father and asked, "He's not supposed to talk, is he?" The man didn't answer. He just stared ahead, camera still in hand, eyes wide. One tourist whispered, Did anyone get that on video? The answer, of course, was yes. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. Shot from a shaky smartphone, it was just 15 seconds long. The girl, the tears, the guard, the voice. "Are you all right, miss?" It didn't take long to spread. A simple caption carried it across the globe. "Royal Guard breaks protocol to comfort crying girl." Before the hour was over, it had gone viral, picked up by news aggregators, reshared by veteran pages, and debated in comment threads that asked, was it allowed? Was it real? Was it human? Back at Wellington Barracks, the footage passed between phones like wildfire. No one laughed, no one made jokes, because those who wore the uniform knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just about stillness, it was about discipline, timing, awareness. And the fact that James Hart had broken formation just for one sentence meant something had pierced through everything he usually held in. By mid-afternoon, the clip had reached the office of Major Thomas Ellison. He watched it once without sound, then again with volume up, and then one more time, his eyes fixed on the exact moment the words were spoken. He didn't rewind for the crowd's reaction. He didn't care about the likes or reposts. He only cared about the man behind the silence. Hart was called in at 1600 hours sharp. He stood in full dress uniform, eyes forward, jaw steady. Major Ellison didn't shout, he didn't pull rank, he didn't even stand. He simply asked, "What made you speak?" Hart answered without pause. "She looked like someone I should have protected." The words hung in the air, not emotional, not dramatic, just true. The major leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. He tapped the edge of the desk once and then reached for his phone. "I think there's someone else who should see this," he said quietly. He didn't specify who. He didn't have to. The clip was forwarded, this time not through social media or chain of command reports, but directly to a contact outside the barracks. Someone who knew exactly what kind of silence a guard kept, and what it meant to break it. Not out of weakness, but out of something stronger than rules. Her name was Amelia Turner. 21. Soft-spoken, a student, a sister, a quiet visitor in a sea of tourists. The girl in the video, caught mid-tier, framed by a line of palace gates, hadn't planned to be there that long. She hadn't even planned to stay in London, but that morning she'd carried out a promise. One that no one else knew about. One she'd been dreading for months. Her brother Matthew had passed away just 6 weeks earlier. Lymphoma. He was 26. Young, sharp-witted, obsessed with history, and he had loved the Royal Guard. As a child, he'd made their red coats out of paper and stood in the hallway refusing to blink until someone laughed. As a teenager, he read every book he could find about military ceremony. And in the final months of his life, during hospital visits and morphine fog, he still spoke of them. He used to say, "They're like anchors, Amelia. Even when the world's moving too fast, they don't fall. They stand. Doesn't matter what's happening around them. They stay still, even when you're scared." On his last day, Matthew made a simple request, not dramatic, not even with tears, just a quiet sentence written in his journal and handed to Amelia with shaking fingers. "Take me to Buckingham. I want to be near the guards I always admired." There were no ashes scattered inside the gates. That wasn't allowed. But she walked to the garden wall that morning and let a small handful fall into the wind, just beyond the edge, just out of sight. It felt too quick, too quiet. She stayed longer than she meant to, not because she wanted to, but because something inside her refused to move. Maybe guilt, maybe sorrow, maybe she was just waiting for the wind to answer her back. She didn't expect to cry. She'd cried enough. But when she turned to leave, she saw him, the guard, standing motionless, just like Matthew described. The same posture, the same strength, the same stare that ignored the noise and held its ground. Something in her broke. She tried to hold it in. She stood quietly, bit her lip. But the tears came anyway, slow, then fast, until her vision blurred. She stepped closer to the ropes without thinking, pulled by something she couldn't explain. It wasn't about the guard himself, it was about what he represented. About the stillness Matthew had spoken of. About the peace she hadn't felt since losing him. And then he spoke. "Are you all right, miss?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because in that moment it wasn't just protocol that had been broken, it was something bigger, something quieter, something her brother would have understood completely. By the third day, the story had moved beyond social media. National outlets picked it up. Headlines read, "Royal Guard breaks protocol to comfort crying tourist." But no one had yet identified the girl in the video. She hadn't commented, hadn't posted. She didn't want attention. She just wanted that moment to stay hers. But the palace took notice. Quietly, without fanfare. The girl was identified through a journalist's lead and background footage. Her name confirmed, her reason understood. At Wellington Barracks, Corporal James Hart was called in again. This time there was no tension, no questions about discipline, just a briefing. A quiet, respectful rundown of who the girl was, what she had done that morning, and why she had cried. He listened without interrupting, hands behind his back, eyes focused. When the officer finished, Hart only said, "Understood." A meeting was offered, private, off camera. No press, no posts. It took place in a quiet room inside the guard quarters. Simple chairs, no uniforms, no rifles. Just two people who had once shared a moment surrounded by strangers and silence. She entered hesitantly, still unsure if it was the right thing. But when she saw him standing the same way he had by the gate, she smiled. A tired smile, the kind that only shows up after weeks of carrying something too heavy. "Thank you," she said. "You broke silence so I wouldn't feel alone." He didn't respond immediately. He reached into his pocket and removed a thin black cord. Attached to it was a charm, faded, worn from years of wear. 3 engraved letters. LH. "This belonged to my sister," he said. "I've carried it every day since we lost her. But yesterday, you reminded me what it's for." He placed it in her hand. No ceremony, no words beyond that. Just a nod. Later that week, the Ministry of Defense issued an internal note, not to discipline, but to document. It read, "Protocol was broken. No correction required. It was broken in service of something deeper than regulation. It was broken in service of humanity." No headline followed, no press release, just that sentence, quietly added to a file most people would never see. The following week, Corporal James Hart returned to his post. Same gate, same uniform, same stillness. The city moved as it always did. Tourists laughed, cameras clicked, and the hum of London life rolled on behind the gates of Buckingham Palace. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing had changed. But something had. A young girl near the rope line stood with her mother, small hand raised in a quiet wave toward the man in red. Hart didn't move, didn't speak, but after a brief pause his eyes closed, just for a moment, and opened again. It wasn't part of the ceremony, it wasn't protocol, but it was enough. A silent thank you, unnoticed by most, but meant for someone who needed it. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that only speaks when it truly matters. Would you have broken silence to help someone, or stood still like always? Hit that subscribe button for more stories where service meets soul, and share this with someone who's ever stood still when they really needed to be held.